Epilepsy is a brain disorder affecting 1 in nearly every 100 persons. 50 million people worldwide, half of whom are under 20 years of age. It is more common than Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, and cerebral palsy combined, and is one of the world's most socially misunderstood diseases. People with epilepsy frequently suffer more from prejudice and discrimination than from the illness itself. Superstition still prevails in Africa, where epilepsy is associated with insanity, thought to be contagious, or perceived as possession by evil spirits. Although marriage prohibition laws were recently repealed, for example, those suffering from epilepsy in many Asian countries still encounter great social prejudice. Demonic terminology associated with the illness has often been employed by Western media, who have also propagated much erroneous scientific data. Reference to epilepsy in song, literature, and film is often associated with madness, mental retardation, and the supernatural. Men suffering from the disease are referred to as being insane or violent, and women as being fragile.
Ouvrir l'esprit à des pensées nouvelles et ainsi enrichir la créativité.
A film proposed by neurologist Dr. Fabien Picard, University Hospital, Geneva.
An epileptic seizure is a kind of electrical storm in the brain.
Philippe Kahn, Professor of Neurophysiology, University Hospital, Grenoble.
Our brain cells, or neurons, play a spontaneous active role in our daily lives. When we speak, move, or do various things, neurons communicate with each other in the following way. An electrical message travels the entire length of a cell, releases a chemical substance in order to pass through the space between cells known as the synapse, before entering the next cell.
Pour que ce message électrique soit lu d'une cellule à une autre, il va devoir franchir l'espace entre deux cellules, qu'on appelle la synapse. Et pour ce faire,
this is how our brain usually works.
Consiste à libérer dans cette synapse un produit chimique.
However, hypercellular activity can cause an epileptic seizure. We say that such cells are hyperexcitable.
Dans une crise d'épilepsie, c'est que l'activation des cellules épileptiques est trop importante.
Not only are they overactive on the individual level, but they also tend to discharge synchronously in groups. This hyperactivation of the neuronal cells generates an abnormal hypersynchronous electrical discharge to the brain, which results in an epileptic seizure. It is important to understand that there are not only one, but many forms of epilepsy. It is not a uniform disease, but a galaxy of diseases. Positive prognosis and benign development concern certain forms of epilepsy, whereas others are extremely serious. In the majority of cases, epilepsy is a curable disease. It would in fact be better to say that seizures are curable, in that anti-epileptic drugs are actually anti-seizure drugs. Anti-epileptic drug treatment will prevent seizures from occurring for 70% or 7 out of every 10 patients. Certain forms of the disease can be healed, for example in cases where children grow out of it as they approach adolescence. Anti-epileptic drug treatment in such cases can be terminated. Other forms of epilepsy can be controlled with long-term drug treatment, which may last years or even a lifetime. However, seizures will continue for 30% of the patients in spite of complex drug therapy. For these patients, unfortunately for a limited number of cases, treatment other than drug therapy may be used. If seizures originate in a specific area of the brain, that is to say, in cases of focal epilepsy, if the area is surgically accessible and if the epilepsy is sufficiently serious and disabling, surgical intervention, which means cutting out a portion of the brain, may be proposed.
Il faut bien sûr que la maladie épileptique soit suffisamment grave et invalidante pour justifier un tel traitement qui consiste quand même à enlever un bout du cerveau.
The battle between a magical interpretation of epilepsy, which is the source of numerous superstitions, and a scientific understanding of the disease has been waged throughout history. People knew more about epilepsy in ancient times, at the time of the Greek doctor Hippocrates, than they did 1500 years later during the Christian Middle Ages. The first epilepsy hospital was built in the 15th century in the French Alsatian town of Rouffach. The hospital was associated with Saint Valentine. What is Saint Valentine's relationship to Rouffach?
Christian Maresco, Professor of Neurology, University Hospital, Strasbourg.
Rouffach has been a place of pilgrimage for epilepsy victims for more than 1,000 years. It was a very secret, little-known pilgrimage dedicated to St. John the Baptist, France's patron saint for the disease. He was later replaced by St. Valentine. The name Valentine sounds something like a German word, which could make one think of epilepsy.
Pierre-Paul Faust, archivist, Rouffach Museum.
Can you explain how the relic came to Rouffach?
Alors là, la tradition veut qu'il y a eu des moines qui venaient donc
According to tradition, pilgrim monks returning from Italy were carrying a piece of St. Valentine's skull. They arrived near Rouffach late in the evening, so decided to stay the night. However, as they prepared to leave the next morning, the bone fragment could not be lifted. They saw this as a sign from heaven that the relic had chosen to stay.
When did this happen?
In the 12th century.
Early 12th century.
The pilgrimage ultimately attained great heights thanks to a monk called Sansetti. The name Valentine was associated with epilepsy because, of course, in German, Fallen, you could say Valentine, means to fall. Sansetti obviously applied this to his marketing strategy.
Was the epilepsy hospital built because of that?
Ancient etchings show that Sansetti abandoned the buildings next to the church and had a regular hospital built. It was similar to hospitals popular at the time, such as the Hospice de Beaune. It had a long nave and a choir where the chapel was situated. Although it was a hospital, it looked more like a church. It quickly grew in reputation, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation.
Was this 15th century hospital created to treat epilepsy?
Yes, and only epilepsy.
And do we know what kind of treatment was given?
Well, there were certain treatments, but patients were treated mostly through prayer.
La maladie avait à voir avec le côté religieux, la possession.
There was a religious connotation, a belief that victims were possessed. This is why images at the time show epileptic patients in the company of wild boars or pigs, which represented the devil. They were the animals into which the epileptic evil spirit should be sent. The patient was neither blamed nor ostracized. On the contrary, he or she was seen as a victim, neither responsible for their condition nor rejected because of it. Patients who were unable to live normal lives or be accepted in other parts of Europe were welcome, taken care of and treated in Rouffach.
La période faste, entre guillemets, est positive par rapport à l'épilepsie, c'est le...
The late Middle Ages, that's to say the 14th, 15th and the first half of the 16th centuries, were the quote-unquote best times for epilepsy. However, from the 17th century on, there was a radical transformation in patient treatment and acceptance of the disease. Rouffach became more of a threat than a place of refuge and care.
Okay. The physical cause of epilepsy was again taken into account during the 16th century. Herbal remedies were used and clean living was encouraged. However, by the 18th century, many believed that one could catch epilepsy by simply witnessing a seizure. Yet it was also at that time that Dr. Tissot published his Treatise on Epilepsy, in which he suggested that the disease might depend on a patient's powerful brain convulsibility or result from a cerebral lesion.
Micheline Louis Courvoisier, historian, Faculty of Medicine, Geneva.
I was fortunate enough to have studied approximately 1,500 letters from either Dr. Tissot's patients or their close friends and relatives. Tissot was an internationally renowned doctor who practiced in Lausanne from 1750 to 1797. He received letters from patients in Europe suffering numerous diseases, including epilepsy. The recurring theme in these letters is profound dismay. Patients describe their seizures in minute detail, as if they were writing a diary. Friends and relatives also express heartfelt dismay in describing their loved one's illness. Allow me to quote the end of a mother's letter concerning her son's epilepsy. There is not the shadow of a doubt that my son, in whose name I have the honor of writing to you, is struck with epilepsy. This it causes me profound grief. But doctors at that time were also dismayed. They knew that few treatments existed to counter the disease. One doctor in particular comes to mind. He wrote to Tissot saying, "In my country," he was from France, "we have always considered this disease to be absolutely incurable and look upon its victims with horror. Such feelings of revulsion and rejection were often mentioned, and they only added to the patient's suffering."
The first anti-epileptic drugs were a veritable scientific revolution. The use of bromide in the 1850s was the first treatment to bring positive results, followed by the use of barbiturates in the early 1900s. The discovery of drugs which diminished seizure frequency or eliminated seizures altogether brought about a change in perception, at least within the medical community. Fears and prejudice began to disappear. We slowly began to think of epilepsy as one neurological disease among others. But superstition and ancient erroneous ideas persist. Such ideas are occasionally mentioned in the media, which only adds to the confusion. Science must fight such prejudice. Numerous research teams currently work on epilepsy in genetics or using nerve cell cultures and brain tissue from epilepsy victims. Others are involved in animal research. In 1982, Dr. Christian Marescot discovered that 10% of laboratory rats have natural epileptic seizures and are a perfect subject for spontaneous epilepsy studies.
L'épilepsie est très très fréquente dans toutes les espèces animales et
Epilepsy is common among animals, particularly rodents. One finds the same principal categories of epilepsy, the same differences from one type of epilepsy to another. Each form of epilepsy has its corresponding drugs for diminishing the number of seizures and drugs which risk increasing them.
Have we verified that the animal prototype corresponds to man?
Pharmacologically speaking, yes. Concerning the mechanisms and circuits involved, yes. But it is much more complicated when dealing with questions of society, family, and bias. However, the pharmacological approach is the same. It's based on the way neurons and neuronal circuits function, which is surprisingly similar in both rodents and human beings. Animal experimentation has clarified and helped in defining which drugs to use. It's also helped in the fight against prejudice. Prejudice will obviously increase if a patient's condition grows worse after months of treatment, but it will diminish if an appropriate treatment eliminates seizures and allows the epilepsy to go unnoticed.
The disease must, of course, be dealt with, but victims of epilepsy also fear other people's judgment. People must be informed. They need to know more about the disease so that epileptic seizures are perceived dispassionately, free of bias, suspicion, and fear. A number of renowned epilepsy sufferers, such as Dostoevsky, Flaubert, and Van Gogh, whose text will be read during the performance, wrote about what they felt as their seizures were coming on, before they lost consciousness, and how they experienced the illness. The writings of these artists help us understand what a person suffering from epilepsy goes through. Thinking of illustrious artists who have written about their own epilepsy, or Beethoven with his hearing impairment, do you think that having a handicap, a neurological or other type of pathology, can enrich one's creativity?
François-René Duchâble, pianist.
Absolutely. I can't prove it scientifically, but I'm sure it's true. I think that suffering can increase one's capacity for creativity and spark one's imagination. Take Beethoven, for example. He was a kind of humanist and extremely generous man. He suffered greatly from his solitude, which, I'm sure, is the case with your patients who must suffer from their inability to communicate, at least during their seizures.
Can you tell us, François-René, how you selected the compositions for the performance?
Ludwig van Beethoven's work had priority in relationship to the texts. His music is highly accentuated and rich in contrast. I feel it parallels epileptic seizure. It wasn't difficult to come up with 3 Beethoven compositions which dominate the performance, not in number but in length. There are also 3 pieces from Schumann as well as others from Chopin and Mussorgsky. The idea was to present compositions of a particular nature to get us away from restrained romanticism.
The composition's emotional aspect inspired you.
qui vous inspirait aussi pour...
Yes, the emotional aspect. Contrast, violence, rupture. Beethoven, for example, creates a crescendo of accelerating energy, but the crescendo never attains climax. It suddenly stops, then slowly builds up again from a kind of emptiness, from something so soft until the wave begins to rise again. Although I'm not an epilepsy specialist like yourself, the texts and what you have told me lead me to imagine that epileptic seizures are similar to this music. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata Finale and the first movement of his Tempest with its questions, feelings of pursuit, powerful notes, intense violence, mystery and moments of newfound peace. And then there is this performance's opening composition, Appassionata, an extremely powerful sonata with mighty hammer-like notes and feelings of obsession, which I'm sure reflect Beethoven's acute awareness of his own infirmity, his deafness.
Does his music come from deep within?
Yes, and it's often very visceral. There is something tribal about it. However, Beethoven's vision of music was intellectual. His works were constructed to perfection. His sense of architecture and composition was extremely precise, and that's the way he wanted it. He leaves little space for improvisation, unlike certain romantic composers such as Chopin, Schumann, Liszt, or even Brahms. Beethoven possesses an architectural force, a tribal-like rhythmic impulse from deep within which carries us away on an extraordinary wave of energy, one which I feel well lends itself to the subject matter, well illustrates and comments on the various texts, be they Dostoevsky's, Flaubert's or Van Gogh's.
Alain Carré, actor.
Alain Carré, how did you go about selecting the texts?
Le choix des textes, il a été assez simple dans le sens.
It was rather simple, really. Among the well-known people with epilepsy, there are three great artists who, coincidentally or not, each lived during the 19th century. There were two authors, Dostoevsky and Flaubert, and one painter who also wrote, notably in his detailed correspondence with his brother Theo. We used your research as a base, along with my own readings, to which I consecrate a large portion of my time. As far as the two authors, Dostoevsky and Flaubert, are concerned, Dostoevsky hardly mentions epilepsy in his personal correspondence, although we did find one or two passages for the performance. Flaubert only employs the word epileptic once in a letter to his mistress Louise Collet. As for Van Gogh, I wouldn't know how to detect hints of the illness in his painting, but his choice of colors and the repetitive stroke of his brush could suggest something related to epilepsy. Why not? And he mentions his doctor's thoughts concerning his epilepsy in his letters to Theo. This is more or less what we came up with in these texts.
De ce qu'en disent les médecins. Donc voilà un petit peu les traces en gros qu'on a pu retrouver dans ces écrits.
Dostoevsky is a crisis novelist. That's to say, he writes about crises in general. Unlike Tolstoy, Dostoevsky neither describes the passing of seasons, love affairs as they happen, nor growing families. He doesn't write great family sagas. His work evolves inevitably towards catastrophe.
Jacques Cateau, professor of Russian literature.
It evokes scandal.
A perpetual storm.
A perpetual storm.
Do you feel that his epilepsy played a role in the crisis aspect of his work?
Yes. Perhaps the inflamed, rapidly soaring and plummeting aspect of his work reflects the intense agitation that people with epilepsy experience.
Peut-être que ça a un rapport avec ce qu'éprouvent les épileptiques lorsqu'ils éprouvent une sorte de fébrilité.
Paroxysm?
Yes, a seizure is paroxysm, followed by sudden calm.
Do we find this in his writing?
Voilà, ça peut se retrouver, oui. Et puis on pense aussi
Yes, of course. We think, for example, Dostoevsky had a seizure immediately after which everything he saw looked red to him. Then, in his novel The Possessed, everything is red. Everything. The necktie, the matchbox, pools of blood, fire, absolutely everything. Perhaps such links do exist. Perhaps his epilepsy gave rise to a certain atmosphere in his work. But above all, I think that although Dostoevsky suffered from epilepsy, he used his genius to harness the disease, and used the disease as an element in his work. Dostoevsky found his way into a world that others could not know, into that moment, just before the fall, which is known as the aura. Prince Myshkin, in The Idiot, experiences auras of happiness. He says, one feels happiness. Dostoevsky repeats this in other novels as well. Happiness for which one would give one's life.
He doesn't present characters suffering from epilepsy in any particular light. Some are good, some are more... He writes about all kinds of characters.
You're right. And this proves that the illness doesn't affect a person's character, for good or for bad. Epilepsy is a disease suffered by both good and bad alike. Dostoevsky normalizes epilepsy, so to speak. He integrates it into everyday life. He doesn't hide or conceal it. However, Myshkin often states that it's extremely embarrassing.
You mean Myshkin in The Idiot?
Yes, of course. Epilepsy is embarrassing, but Dostoevsky weaves it into the storyline. A simple example of this is when tension rises. As a seizure is building up, a storm is also building up outside. Darkness pervades, etc. He uses epilepsy as an element.
A natural element.
Yes, almost natural, biological. That's to say, it's like our asking contemporary society to accept the physically and mentally impaired. And here is this character in The Idiot who suffers an impairment known as epilepsy, but who actually seduces people, not because of it, but because they feel compassion, curiosity, and take a liking to him. Their affection and curiosity grow because Myshkin doesn't hide his condition. He describes it with simplicity.
And it's accepted.
Yes, he gets people to accept him. Society accepts him, and he himself accepts the disease.
Did you know that many people are victims of their health, of their immeasurable conviction that they are normal?
Yes.
What do you think about that?
It's an important point, and a good lesson not to feel superior to others, not to look down on people, but to see them as they really are. It's an extremely Dostoevskian theme. People originally thought of Dostoevsky as someone who wrote about pity for others. But I don't like the term. A French writer came up with that idea. I believe today we should call it compassion, but I don't like that either. Lucidity suits me better. Consideration of others. The name Dostoevsky comes from Dostoyevo, which means dignity.
Flaubert Museum, Rouen.
Can you tell us something about this place?
This is the Flaubert and Medical History Museum. It was the home of Rouen Hospital's chief surgeon, Achille Cléophas Flaubert. His son, the author Gustave Flaubert, was born here.
Arlette Dubois, curator.
Ce qu'il faut dire, c'est que ce n'est pas courant pour un enfant de vivre dans un hôpital et l'intimité familiale.
We must remember that it is not common for a child to live in a hospital. Flaubert's family was in constant contact with illness and death. He was only 12 at the time of the 1832 cholera epidemic and would hear the death rattles through the dining room walls.
Il avait une dizaine d'années, il entendait le râle des mourants à travers la cloison pendant les dîners.
He once wrote a letter describing how he had been playing in the garden with his sister Caroline when they climbed up to the operating theater window and saw their father dissecting cadavers. One gets the impression that death, allegorically or otherwise, was a childhood companion.
Dominique Parrain, you are a pediatric epileptologist at the Rouen University Hospital. How was Flaubert's epilepsy diagnosed?
Dominique Parrain, neuropediatrician, University Hospital, Rouen.
Diagnosis was based on information found in Flaubert's correspondence, wherein he describes his seizures to perfection. He grew up in a medical environment and took great care to be scientifically precise. Epileptologists everywhere agree that Flaubert suffered from the disease. His late epilepsy was probably caused by a prenatal lesion, a small malformation of the brain. Although it was small enough not to interfere with his intellectual development, he was a brilliant man. It was still enough to cause epilepsy.
Elle sortit. Les murs tremblaient.
She disappeared.
Le plafond l'écrasait.
The walls trembled. The ceiling crushed in on her. She was lost in stupor. She had grown unaware of herself, except for the pulsing arteries which she seemed to hear escaping from her body like deafening music filling the countryside. Fiery colored cells suddenly seemed to explode in the air like livid spheres, smoothing themselves out, then pivoting.
Flaubert never wrote about epilepsy?
It's true that he avoided using that specific word. He spoke of his nervous attacks and even wanted to write a book on the subject, He was going to call it The Spiral, which is a very evocative title, but he never wrote it. Allow me to read an excerpt concerning The Spiral from a letter to Louise Collet. This is what he wrote. I regret nothing from my youth. I was terribly bored. I dreamed of suicide. I was devoured by all kinds of melancholy. But my nervous condition helped me. It deferred all of that to the physical plane and cleared my mind. Then I had the most unusual psychological experiences that no one could imagine, or it would be better to say that no one else could feel. I will revenge myself one day by writing about it. But health-wise, it scares me. I must wait until these experiences are far behind me to be able to think about them in abstract terms, without endangering myself or the book.
Metin Arditi, author.
I feel that Van Gogh is, for some magical, inexplicable reason, the total quintessential artist.
L'artiste extrême. Pour des raisons inexplicables, au fond assez magiques, il a quelque chose à dire. Il avait un besoin.
He has something to say and a frenzied need to share.
Et à partir de ce moment-là,
This need, not a desire for success, is the motivating force behind his work.
Et pas un désir de succès. Ce qu'il livre, ce qu'il donne comme
His art has the quality of absolute truth.
une vérité absolue.
He couldn't care less, as we say, about anything else.
Il n'en a rien à faire, comme on dit vulgairement.
All he wants to do is share the violence of his feelings.
Je dirais partager la violence de ses sentiments.
Do you feel violence in his paintings?
Énorme. Et ce qui
Tremendous.
est extrêmement
Tremendous.
c'est que
But his violence,
cette solitude,
his loneliness, is not aggressive.
elle n'est pas méchante.
It is deeply moving.
Mais si nous le voyons,
Yet, if we saw him sitting there cursing and drunk on absinthe,
imbibé d'absinthe,
we would turn our backs on
en
him,
train de proférer,
just like everyone else.
nous lui tournerions le dos comme les autres.
Saint-Rémy, 23 mai 1889. Je suis encore parlant de
Saint Remy, May 23rd, 1889. I am grateful for one more thing about my condition. I have observed that others also hear sounds and strange voices during their seizures, and that everything before them seems to change. Knowing this has soothed the trace of horror I felt during my seizures, of when seizure hits you so unexpectedly, you are terrified beyond measure. Once you understand that this is part of the disease, you look at it differently. If I hadn't seen others alienated in the same way, I would never have been able to stop thinking about it.
Do you think that illnesses such as epilepsy can strengthen one's character or creativity?
I firmly believe so. It forces one to face all kinds of personal problems. And this is strength.
Strength of character and creativity together?
Strength of character. Creativity is an expression of a strong character. It is a result. It implies risk-taking and daring. It's easier to take risks when we know who we are. From the moment that we accept ourselves, others are free to feel their own feelings and think their own thoughts. This allows one to progress artistically.
I dare think that once we know what it is, once we are aware of our condition, that we are prone to seizures, we will learn to be less surprised by anguish and fear. My seizures have been growing lighter over the past 5 months. I hope that things are getting better, or at least that my seizures won't be as violent as they used to be.
Selon vous, comment l'épilepsie est-elle perçue aujourd'hui?
How is epilepsy perceived today?
Je pense que l'épilepsie est quand même perçue avec beaucoup de crainte.
I think that people still fear epilepsy. It makes them anxious. It's hard for ordinary people to understand it because it is such abnormal behavior. It should certainly be discussed more openly.
The convulsion was such that even moving repulsed me, and nothing would have been as wonderful as never waking again. But now my revulsion for life has diminished, and my melancholy is less pronounced. But I still want nothing, desire little or nothing at all, and have practically no interest in such ordinary things as seeing my friends, of whom, nonetheless, I think quite often.
Have you ever imagined yourself suffering from epilepsy?
Never.
If you imagine yourself as having had epilepsy, do you think it would have changed your life?
I don't know. It's difficult to imagine. One shouldn't be pretentious. It's a difficult question. I think that it would have made me even more of a loner.
And stronger?
Oh yes, certainly. Certainly.
Sylvie Loeb and Christina Lenzi.
Did you enjoy the performance? What did you feel?
I was very moved. The text and music, the complicity between the pianist and the actor, it was extremely moving. The performance was really very touching.
I adored the music, and above all the actor, the way he read the texts. It was truly, it spoke to me, and so many things came to mind.
It was like revisiting my own experience, times of great sadness in my life.
It wasn't make-believe. He wasn't describing something. He was living it.
Did your epilepsy open new avenues of thought? Stimulate your creativity?
Yes. I was an art historian. I dealt with other people's work. I would never have had the courage to pick up a pencil myself, because I simply didn't know how to draw. I was also extremely critical. But then I had a terrible time at the hospital after my operation. I had trouble finding my words. My brother brought me some colored pencils and encouraged me to express myself through painting. It was through epilepsy that I expressed my creativity, something I otherwise wouldn't have dared to do. I also grew much more sensitive to beauty. That's what spoke to me in the texts. They say the very same thing. When I'm by the lake and see the light, the sun, I am simply... I don't think I would have been able to before. Just feeling such pleasure fills me with happiness, with beauty, with all I see. I can apply such intense moments of happiness to my art.
Et que j'arrive ensuite à reporter dans ce qui est artistique.
What do you think could be done to change things, to improve society's attitude towards epilepsy?
Recognition. We should be treated like normal beings, not as if we were something different. It is extremely difficult because people simply don't understand. One feels ashamed to say to family and friends, "I don't remember," or other such things. It is really very hard.
Avoid generalizing. Avoid a unilateral approach to the problem. This would be the best way to reduce bias. Show that there are extremely diverse forms of epilepsy, each with its own challenges, mechanisms, and reactions to treatment. We try to explain to parents that being told their child has epilepsy when they come to us to describe their seizures means nothing, and that they need to understand that behind the word epilepsy lies a very precise terminology related to diverse mechanisms, and that behind those mechanisms lie diverse treatments. If we cannot ignore the fact that this condition exists, we can at least respect it by not making it out to be worse than it is, by not exaggerating what it means, but approach it more rationally, or I dare say, only rationally.
A healthy man is a matter-of-fact man who lives this lowly earthly life in a self-satisfied, orderly way. But the possibility of another world reveals itself as soon as he grows ill. Dostoevsky had a unique understanding of disease. He conceived epilepsy as a potential source of greater spiritual enrichment. This idea was extremely important to him, and he wanted to share it with others. His efforts to inform his readers about epilepsy were as avant-garde as they were wise. We must continue to fight the prejudice that surrounds this disease by discussing it more frequently in our daily lives, in our own small sphere.